Any tips on reducing stress at the groomer? Seems like my dog might be freezing in that situation. And this comment was left on a video where we were talking about, in part, situations where dogs seem fine, but are actually going into a freeze state. And that freeze state is a survival state that actually indicates higher levels of stress than when the dog is in an active survival state like fidget, fight, or flight. And it's actually one of the most tragic misunderstandings I see in interpreting canine behavior, because it's a situation where the dog behaviorally becomes a lot more manageable, but is actually experiencing much higher amounts of distress. And they're mistaken for being fine or comfortable when they're actually, again, experiencing the higher end of incredibly big stress. And this can be dangerous too, because if someone is working or engaging with a dog who they believe to be totally fine, and the dog is actually super, super stressed and in a survival state, it's going to be a very quick jump over to something like a fight response or a flight response. And now there's a bite or the dog is gone, and it feels like it came out of nowhere. But it didn't come out of nowhere. There are ways that we can tell that a dog is actually in a freeze state. One of the things that makes it so tricky is that unlike fight or flight or fidget, the dog has now gone into a state of hypoarousal. And so a lot of the stress signs that we get with more active coping, like long lips, wrinkles on the forehead, the eyes, and the commissures of the mouth, panting from an elevated heart rate or a very tense mouth, tense muscles, maybe a heightened tail, excessive shedding or dander, those signs are gone. And that's because the learner has said, I am not going to survive this, and so let's make it painless. And they kind of just are dissociating. We can't ask dogs if they dissociate, but think of it as dissociating. And then we're going to see the fallout from that afterward. So a lot of times the dog is then going to sleep really hard. They're exhausted, and not in a good satiated way. They are exhausted. They have just survived this ordeal. And then you have to go back through. So freeze is happening back in the hindbrain. You have to go back up through fight or flight to make it back to the thinking brain. And so you're going to see increased reactivity sometimes for days afterward. And I say reactivity, but this could also look like toddler tiredness in general. And so it's going to look like hyperarousal or increased reactivity or bigger fear responses or getting into everything, whatever that higher stress level looks like for one's dog. One of the really unfortunate things and tricky things is that most dogs are having a really, really bad time at the groomers. And most grooming situations are not set up for the dog to be successful. And that is not in any way a shot at groomers. That is more a comment about business models. The time that it takes to get a dog comfortable with the handling that's happening, with the tools that are happening, is not something that is baked into the vast majority of business models in a grooming business. And it is not something that the vast majority of pet parents are working on at home with their dogs. It is a common situation for dogs to go into freeze. They are often in situations on equipment restrained in ways that make fight and flight impossible. They're not even in those situations really able to engage in species typical behaviors that would help reduce their stress. They are separated from their safe person, and they're experiencing things like high heat, loud sounds, physical sensations that they don't understand. I am not a groomer. And I've never worked as a groomer. I do have many friends and colleagues who have or do work as groomers. And they have shared that, unfortunately, in the vast majority of situations, dogs are being treated very inhumanely in the name of getting such things done. And that is, again, not to say that groomers as a whole are harming dogs. What that is to say is that, especially I think in a lot of these like big box models, or in places that are doing like a high volume, lots of turnover, focused on quantity, which is a common part of a business model in a lot of dog related situations that focus on quantity. We see this with dog daycares too. This can be a problem that they run into. And so a lot of dogs have a really bad time. And when they have a bad time, there is often a pressure to get it done anyway, because a lot of people are going to be upset if they come to pick up their dog and find out that the services have not been completed, even if actually that was the best thing to do for the well-being of the dog. And so often the training and instructions in these types of situations is to push through. And unfortunately, that means shoving the dog, pushing the dog to a freeze state, teaching them that their communications at being uncomfortable and even their active survival responses at these big stress moments are not effective, and that they are not able to have control over their body and their experience in that way. And that can be really damaging, especially for my client population where I work with dysregulated dogs. And so how do we help our dogs have a non-traumatizing time? And how do we set them up in situations where abusive behavior is not being used to complete the job? I think one of the things can certainly be having a personal relationship with your groomer. I would recommend staying away from like your Petco's and PetSmarts and places like that. I would want to know the person who is handling my dog and grooming my dog. I would want to talk with them about my priorities. I would want to make sure that they know that my priority is not just my dog's physical grooming needs, but also their mental and emotional health. And so if my dog is having a hard time and we are not able to complete the job, I want them to feel super, super comfortable with that. I would also likely be using a vent medication as prescribed by my vet to help keep my dog's stress levels lower. If my dog is a dog who needs to go to the groomer, something that I would be working on and prioritizing working on would be getting my dog comfortable with the tools that are going to be used, comfortable with the equipment that's going to be used, comfortable being handled in the ways that they will be handled for the needs that they have. I would also be doing things like happy visits to the groomers. So creating positive associations, going on visits where we're just having a fun time at the groomers. And again, a lot of this requires this collaboration with the groomer. I might prioritize looking for a groomer who specializes in fear and anxiety, or who has that built into their business model, that they work with dogs who need extra support. And even if my dog isn't generally anxious, I might make use of a service like that if my dog is not, fully acclimated to the grooming process. I think too, it's super important to stay on top of the dog's grooming needs. So again, I've never worked as a groomer, but what I understand from my grooming friends is that oftentimes folks will bring in their pets long past the point where like regular daily care hasn't been taken, or where they should have been seen several weeks or even months ago, which can make the process more painful and stressful for the dog. So making sure, again, collaborating with my groomer to make sure I'm doing everything that I need to do on my end to set everyone up for success in that way. I personally, as a person, I would never be comfortable leaving my dog in a situation where I'm not there with them. They're not taken away at the vet's office. And I have had grooming services for my dogs before, but I have been able to stay with them through that process. And obviously I recognize that's not going to be something that is possible or accessible to everyone. But if you are working with a trainer, if you're working with a groomer on these sorts of things, sometimes we can ask the groomers if they're comfortable recording what's happening so that we can get into the nuances of body language and behavior and see where the dog might need additional support.